on metamodernism. What is metamodernism? It's a relatively new term, and today we are just going to try to, come up with some basic pointers, if not understanding, about what is metamodernism. So these are just initial thoughts, and hopefully, in this series we will be talking about metamodernism and obviously modernism and related term postmodernism. Because when we talk about metamodernism, obviously we need to talk about modernism, and we can't talk about metamodernism without talking about postmodernism and all that. Okay. And obviously, like other videos, other sessions, it's an exploratory session. So we are exploring the meaning of postmodernism. So what is important here is not just what you and I will learn about what modernism is, or what metamodernism is, or what postmodernism is, but the basic, I think, thrust of this whole channel and these sessions is to learn how to explore things. So more than the information, what is important is the map of this exploration, the way we explore things, and if there are any patterns behind that exploration. So that is I think the most important thing. So that's the meaning of a distinction which I've often made and probably haven't been able to explain properly between philosophy and philosophizing. So if philosophy is, knowing what philosophers said about certain things and what are their reasons, and if there are any counter reasons and what are our views, that is philosophy, let's say. But how we go about doing philosophy, that's what philosophizing is. So exploring part is philosophizing, and I think that's the most important part, and often this part is neglected, because it doesn't matter whether you know what a certain philosopher said and what are his or her reasons and what can be the counter reason. You can always find out that in books and articles, and it is becoming easier and easier to know those things due to the development of internet and all those things. But philosophizing, it's not easy to learn because it is a practice. If you know philosophizing, then even if you don't know a particular philosophy, you can always try to find out, and it's not difficult to find out about what a philosopher said. You can read a book or article. But for philosophizing, you don't need, there are certain books, but you don't learn philosophizing through reading books. You learn philosophizing through the practice of philosophy, through doing philosophy, through exploring. So one of the purpose of this channel and these sessions is hopefully to learn how to philosophize. So philosophy in practice, or exploration in practice, or thinking in practice. Yep. Okay. So if we are looking at, there are many ways we can start our exploration. One obvious way is to see that you have three terms: metamodernism. So you have modernism, that's the base term, and then you have metamodernism and postmodernism. So you can readily see that what's actually constant here is modernism, and post and metamodernism are some sort of reactions to modernism, or some sort of interaction with modernism. It doesn't seem like they are, you know, concepts in their own right. So in a sense, they are relational concepts. I mean, every concept in a sense can be relational. Modernism itself is relational, but even within that large concession, we can say that some concepts are relatively more self subsistent than others. So in that sense, we can say that modernism is a concept in its own right. So without modernism, metamodernism and postmodernism wouldn't exist. But modernism can exist without postmodernism and metamodernism. Okay, so I think in order to get a grip on these two concepts, it seems to me that it's very important to understand modernism first. Okay, so what is modernism then? Let's start with that. What is modernism? So, modernism can be looked at least from two different angles. So as a period in history, and I'll be using modernism and modernity interchangeably here, and modernism as a set of ideas. So at a period in history, it's something which start emerging in human history in certain geographical location, and then it becomes dominant in the world over the next centuries. And today, maybe we can say that is the dominant civilization in the world, or the dominant set of ideas in the world, in different manifestation and at different levels of intensity. And it's a set of ideas which replaces an earlier set of ideas. So it's a period in history and a set of ideas which replaces earlier period in history and earlier set of ideas. That's one way of looking at modernism. More specifically, we can say that modernism is a civilization. So civilization is a more comprehensive word which includes set of ideas, which includes worldview, which includes system and subsystems and all that. So modernism is a period in history and a civilization which replaces earlier civilization. And that civilization can be termed as, Loosely, Christian civilization, not a Christian religion as such, because Christian religion was part of that civilization. So, Christian civilization, modernism replaces Christian civilization. So, that tells us that this civilizational change occurred in a specific location as well, mostly, Christendom, especially Western Europe and Northern Europe and all those areas. And then spread from there to European colonies in America and Australia and New Zealand, and from there to other colonies like India. And then, with the rise of imperialism, it spread throughout the world. That's one way of looking at modernism as a civilization which replaces the earlier civilization. So modernism is a civilization. Modernism is a civilization which replaces the earlier civilization. Christian civilization, in terms of ideas, in terms of worldview, in terms of system, in terms of subsystem, in terms of life world and all that. So it's a total change. It's sort of a revolution, civilizational revolution. And that started in Europe, and that started, in, I don't know, 14th, 15th century. And today we can say, at least in the developed world, it's almost complete. The process of this transitional change is almost complete. And when we say modernism is a new civilization which replaces the old civilization, obviously we don't mean that, it doesn't contain anything from the previous civilization, but whatever it contains, it integrates into itself according to its own core ideas, which are different from the core ideas which were dominant in the previous civilization. Okay, so that's one way of looking at modernism. So, if we say that modernism is a civilization which replaces an earlier Christian civilization, at the civilizational level, we can obviously conceptualize this change and try to understand this change from many different angles. And this has been done over the last few centuries, obviously. And how we understand this civilizational change will depend on our interests, what are we interested in and all. But roughly speaking, we can try to understand this change at a few, general level. For example, at the epistemological level. At the epistemological level, generally we can say that with modernism, reason, a particular type of reason. Obviously, there was a reason. Reason had a very important role to play in Christian civilization as well, but a particular conception of reason emerges as a dominant epistemological dominant epistemological concept, let's say, within modernism, and it replaces the role which was played by, let's say, revelation or something similar in the Christian civilization. And all other sources of knowledge become subservient to this new conception of reason. So we can say that epistemologically in Christian civilization, reason was defined by and was subservient to revelation, let's say. On the other hand, revelation becomes is totally gone or become very minor subjective notion in the new civilization, and a particular conception of reason replaces that concept of revelation in the modern civilization. That was one thing, one sea change, epistemologically speaking, let's say. So that would be manifested in the kind of discipline or the kind of knowledge which emerges as the dominant knowledge in two civilizations. So in Christian civilization, the dominant knowledge was the knowledge of the knowledge of the Christian religion, and the knowledge which revolve around the Christian texts and the Jewish texts. On the other hand, in the new modernist civilization, the knowledge which will become dominant would be the knowledge which revolves around this new conception of reason, let's say, and that knowledge basically is science and different types of sciences and a particular type of philosophy and so forth. Now, the second level at which we can try to conceptualize this transition from modernity, Christian civilization to modern civilization, is the level of metaphysics. Let's say the core concept of metaphysical concept in Christian civilization was that of God. And the relation to this God, or conception of this God, the whole conception of and our view of this universe was conceptualized in terms of this conception of God. So our view of nature and our relation to nature, our view of humanity and our relation to humanity, our view of the biological and theological world and its relation to, so all was conceptualized in relation to this concept of God. So this was the core concept of metaphysical concept of Christian civilization. On the other hand, in the modern civilization, this concept, I don't necessarily want to say that it was totally replaced, but totally rejected, but it became a minor concept or subservient concept. Or so God was replaced by another man. It's a metaphysical concept. So this new civilization was based on and centered around a certain conception of man as a creator or self-creator, whether this conception of man was conceptualized in terms of individual being, or in terms of a species, or in terms of community. Man became a core concept, and the concept of God became, irrelevant or subservient to this concept of man. So the concept of man, God, was at time was important in the sense that, at least in earlier phases, the concept of man was conceptualized in relation to the earlier concept of God. But as modernist civilization developed and became self-subsistent and self-sufficient, the role of God became less and less prominent. So the man becomes a new God in a sense. And now everything else, like nature, the universe, is understood in terms of this conception of man. Okay, and the last one is the next, and the last one, which I'll consider here, level on which we can compare these two civilizations and can understand and try to understand the transition, is through eschatological concept. So start with the epistemological and then metaphysical, and this last one can be called eschatological. Eschatological. And by eschatological angle, we mean that the role of this world and our life in this world and a view of history goes through a sea change as well, although modernism obviously draws heavily on Christian civilization in this aspect as well. But in Christian civilization, we can say that this world was a transitional place, a transitory place. So this world is a temporary abode, and there's a world to come. So this world is the world of trial, the world of diseases, the world of death, and all. But there would be a next world, and that next world would, you know, depending on your view, would be after this world, whether built here or somewhere else, but would be after the end of this world. And that would be eternal world, eternal life, without diseases, without death. And that will end in paradise for certain people and hell for certain other people. Um, and that destination will depend on whether you followed the Christian metaphysical and epistemological and moral dictates or not. So in modernism, this world is in a sense eternal. And yes, this world is the world of disease and death, but disease and death can be overcome. So there's a view of history as well. We can make progress. And we can create paradise, but this paradise would not be a gift from the Christian God, but would be the gift of human beings' own efforts by using their labor, by using their reason, by using their imagination and all this. So human beings can themselves create paradise in this world. So there's no hereafter, although there is a hereafter, but that hereafter is the creation of human beings themselves. They can create a utopia or near utopia in this world, and they can make this world into a paradise, and they don't have to wait for, and maybe they can overcome disease. And some people, at least at the earliest stages, thought that we can also overcome death. So these were the three main angles through the transition occurred. Okay, I mean, through which we can understand the transition. Now once we have modernism, and modernism become a dominant civilization, then obviously especially if you are a modernist, you have a view of history and view of change. So you always wonder whether this civilization will be replaced by another civilization, or whether this civilization is achieving what it promised. And so there's always a re-evaluation going on whenever a civilization becomes dominant and it becomes the sole master. So in a sense, we can say that both postmodernism and metamodernism were a reaction against modernism. But the question is whether they are reactions which harbinger civilizational change, or they are reaction within the modernist civilization. In other words, whether they are family quarrels like earlier Christian quarrels. And if they are family quarrels, what is the level? Whether they are at the level of the split between Eastern and Western Church, or whether they are at the level of the emergence of Protestantism, or whether they are at the level of the emergence of Renaissance or humanistic tendencies within Christianity, earlier Christianity, etc. So these questions emerge whenever we talk about modernism and postmodernism and metamodernism. And different people have different views about that. In the heydays of postmodernism, people thought that it was a harbinger of, if not a civilizational change, it was a harbinger of a major change. But obviously, once the dust has settled, people have a more modest view of what postmodernism was. And metamodernism is, in a sense, accepting that reality. But we'll try to pick up these because this requires a special attention, because that's our main goal, to understand what is postmodernism and specifically understand what is metamodernism and how are they both related to each other and how they are related to modernism. So we'll start that in the next session. But this session is important for the next session in the sense that the next session will build on what we have understood or achieved in this session. Okay, see you in this next session. Sorry. Okay, bye.